you're a sourdough baker, you're likely no stranger to baking your loaves in Dutch ovens. I exclusively have baked in Dutch ovens up until the past couple of months and have had a lot of success but also a lot of failures with doing so. I made the switch to baking in loaf pans a couple of months ago when I realized that I was really starting to dislike baking sourdough bread simply because I was having to bake it in a Dutch oven. I think this is primarily in part to I was starting to scale my farm stand and baking closer to 20 loaves per weekend versus the 8 to 10 I started out with. And if you bake in Dutch ovens, you know just how heavy they can get after a while of lifting them in and out of your oven, but then also the fact that, at least for my oven, I have a standard kitchen oven, I could only bake 2 loaves at a time. So to bake 8 to 10 loaves would take me 5 hours at an absolute minimum. I had put off trying to bake in a loaf pan for a really long time just because I was scared that I wasn't going to have any success with it. But one day I finally jumped in, and although it was my first loaf, I had a fair amount of success and felt confident enough that I could move forward. I can now say that I bake anywhere from 16 to 20 loaves a week for my farm stand, and am able to do that in about 4 hours, and that's running after kids and getting all of my other house chores done in between. So my process for baking in loaf pans looks very similar to that as if I was going to bake in Dutch ovens. The primary difference is I do my cold fermentation in my loaf pans, and then instead of having a Dutch oven lid to trap in that steam, you are going to want an additional loaf pan to put on top of your bread. I did make the mistake a couple times of using all of my bread pans to cold ferment, and then the next day rolled around and I realized I had no bread pans to put on top in order to bake. So I did a lot of shuffling into Banneton baskets so I could repurpose some of the loaf pans, and it was honestly such a mess. One of the other primary differences if you go from baking in Dutch ovens to baking in loaf pans is the amount of bread you can bake at one time. I have found that baking 4 loaves at a time is really a sweet spot for me and doesn't overcrowd my oven, and also allows all of the bread to bake in a similar way. I feel like if you bake too many loaves at once, you might run into them not cooking evenly because there's just too much going on in your oven. I also like to line my loaf pans with parchment paper. It helps your bread not stick to the pan, even if it is non-stick. It is just, I would say, a safety precaution to make sure you can remove the bread easily from the loaf pan. All in all, I definitely prefer the loaf pan method over the Dutch oven method, but there are a couple cons that I have found over time with making the swap. The first thing that comes to mind is when you switch over to loaf pans, naturally your bread is going to come out in the shape of a loaf and not a bowl. This might not be problematic for some. I know it works really well for our family because we like to have a slice of toast in the morning, and I can make sandwiches for my kids on it, and it's just a little bit easier. But the bowl is really classic, and I feel like a lot of people think of that when they think of sourdough bread. The second issue that I have found with baking in the loaf pans is it is a little more temperamental in terms of burning from what I've seen. When I was baking in Dutch ovens, I would always preheat my oven at 475 or 500 degrees, and then I would drop the temperature to about 450 degrees when I would put my Dutch oven in. I found that always gave me really good results with an oven spring, and I just liked the way my bread looked when I did this method. However, when I switched to loaf pans and tried this, sometimes it would work really well, and other times I would just end up with a burnt bottom. Recently though, I've found a lot of luck with just preheating my oven to 450 degrees, baking the loaf at 450 degrees for 30 minutes, and then removing the top loaf pan and baking for another 15 minutes. All in all, I would say if you are looking to scale your micro bakery or your farm stand, cottage bakery, whatever you're doing as far as sourdough bread goes, Definitely look into the loaf pan method if you are not wanting to make the jump to a commercial oven just yet.